There's a woman sitting at her kitchen table at midnight, surrounded by 4 different budgeting apps open on her laptop, a spreadsheet she built herself 2 years ago that she hasn't updated since March, and a small paper receipt from a coffee shop that she is, quite literally, staring at like it. Might explain something about her entire life. $4.20. That's what the receipt says. And she is doing actual math in her head, real math, trying to figure out what that $4.20 will cost her by the time she's 65 if she'd invested it instead, compounded over decades, some numbers she read once in an article that made her feel physically ill. She closes the laptop. She doesn't update the spreadsheet. She doesn't cancel the subscription she's been meaning to cancel for 8 months. She just sits there, in the quiet, feeling like a failure over $4.20, while somewhere in the back of her mind, a much bigger, much scarier number sits completely untouched, unexamined, ignored, because it's too overwhelming to even look at directly. She has never negotiated her salary, not once, not in 6 years of working. She has money sitting in a checking account earning essentially nothing because she's been meaning to figure out investing for years and never quite gets around to it. And yet here she is, at midnight, feeling guilty about a coffee. Here's the sentence that's going to reframe almost everything you think you know about becoming financially successful, and it's going to feel almost rebellious the first time you really hear it. The coffee was never the problem. The guilt about the coffee is the problem, because it's a symptom of an entire industry that has convinced millions of people to obsess over $4 decisions while completely ignoring the $400,000 ones sitting quietly, untouched, in the exact same life. There's a man who built an entire philosophy around this exact observation, and it made him, for a while, one of the most controversial voices in personal finance, precisely because he refused to tell people to stop buying coffee. His name is Ramit Sethi, and by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why he believes most people are optimizing the wrong 4% of their financial life while completely neglecting the other 96%. Why automating a handful of decisions once can outperform a decade of daily willpower, and why the actual goal was never to deprive yourself of anything. It was to spend extravagantly, guilt-free, on the things you genuinely love, while ruthlessly cutting the things you don't care about at all. Stick with me, because that idea, spend extravagantly on what you love, sounds like the opposite of financial advice, right up until you understand exactly why it works better than almost anything else out there. Let's go back to where Ramit's own thinking actually started, because, like most of these stories, it didn't begin with some grand theory. It began with a mistake, and a fairly embarrassing one at that. Ramit was in college when he first got interested in personal finance, and like a lot of people who eventually become obsessive about a subject, his interest started with a genuine loss. He'd applied for a scholarship, put together an application he was proud of, and won it. The prize money arrived, and Ramit, feeling flush with his first real windfall, decided to invest it himself without doing much research first, and he lost a meaningful chunk of it almost immediately through decisions he'd made with far more confidence than actual knowledge. That loss stung enough that he did something a lot of people who lose money never actually do. Instead of walking away from the whole subject entirely, swearing off investing forever, he got obsessed with understanding exactly what he'd done wrong, and more importantly, what actually works. He started reading everything he could find, testing ideas on his own money, and eventually built a blog where he shared what he was learning, mostly to a small, skeptical audience of friends and classmates who thought personal finance was, frankly, kind of boring. Here's where things get interesting, And here's the first real twist in this story. The more Ramit studied how people actually behave with money, not how they say they behave, not how a textbook says they should behave, but how real people, under real pressure, with real paychecks, actually make decisions, the more he noticed something that almost nobody else in personal finance seemed willing to say out loud. Most financial advice focuses on the wrong problem entirely. It focuses on small, painful, constant sacrifices: skip the coffee, bring lunch from home, cut the streaming subscriptions, because those are easy to talk about, easy to visualize, easy to feel virtuous about. But Ramit noticed that these small sacrifices almost never actually move the needle in any meaningful way. And worse, meanwhile, the actual big decisions, the ones that genuinely determine whether someone builds wealth or doesn't, sat almost completely ignored. Whether you negotiate your salary, whether your money is actually invested, or just sitting in a checking account, earning nothing while inflation quietly eats away at it. Whether you automated your finances so that saving and investing happen without requiring willpower every single month, or whether you're relying on your own motivation at 11 at night, exhausted after a long day, to manually transfer money into saving, eventually, because willpower is an exhaustible resource, and most people run out of it by Tuesday. Here's a story that Ramit tells often, because it genuinely changed how he thought about all of this. Involving a close friend from college, someone we'll simply call his friend, because that's how it appears in his own retelling. This friend was smart, genuinely smart, the kind of person who could hold his own in any conversation about world events or business strategy. But for years he refused to invest a single dollar, despite having a good, stable income. Ramit asked him about it constantly, gently at first, then more directly, and the answer was always some version of the same thing. He was waiting for the right moment. He wanted to understand the market better first. He was worried about a crash happening right after he finally put money in. Years went by. The friend kept earning a good salary. The friend kept his money sitting in a checking account, technically safe, but quietly losing value every single year to inflation, while the market, over that same stretch of years, grew substantially. Ramit calculated, at one point, roughly how much money his friend had lost, not through any dramatic mistake, but simply through inaction, through years of waiting for a perfect moment that never actually needed to exist in the first place. The number was large enough that when Ramit finally told him directly, his friend went quiet for a long moment. Not the $4 coffee. Years of inaction on the actual decision that mattered most. This is the exact contrast that became the foundation of everything Ramit eventually built. And it's worth sitting with for a second, because it applies to almost everyone listening to this right now. There is an entire universe of small, visible, easy to obsess over financial decisions, and there is a much smaller set of big, invisible, easy to avoid financial decisions, and almost all of the actual outcome, whether someone ends up wealthy or not, comes down to the second category, not the first. Ramit built an entire program around fixing this imbalance, and it's structured in a way that's genuinely different from most personal finance advice you've probably encountered before. He calls it a 6-week program, not because it takes exactly 6 weeks for everyone, but because it's built to be done in stages, each one laying the groundwork for the next, rather than trying to fix your entire financial life in one overwhelming weekend, which is exactly the kind of approach that leads most people to give up entirely within a few days. The first stage of the program has nothing to do with budgeting in the traditional sense, and this is where Ramit's advice starts to diverge sharply from almost everything else out there. He argues that traditional budgeting, The kind where you track every single category of spending down to the dollar forever, month after month, is a system that works for almost nobody long-term because it requires constant willpower and constant attention, and most people simply don't have an infinite supply of either. Instead, he introduces something he calls a conscious spending plan, and the distinction matters more than it might sound like at first. A traditional budget asks you to restrict everything roughly equally. A conscious spending plan asks you to identify your fixed costs, your rent, your utilities, your minimum debt payments, and then divide everything else into just a few categories: savings, investments, and guilt-free spending money. The guilt-free spending category is the part that tends to surprise people the most, because it explicitly gives you permission, real permission, backed by actual numbers, to spend money on things you enjoy without feeling bad about it, as long as your savings and investment targets are already being hit automatically every single month before you even see the money. There's a specific phrase Ramit uses that tends to stick with people long after they first hear it, something he calls money dials. The idea is simple, and honestly, it's one of the more freeing ideas in the entire book. Everyone has a small number of things they genuinely, deeply care about spending money on: travel, or nice meals out, or a particular hobby, or convenience services that save them time. And everyone also has a much longer list of things they don't actually care about at all, but spend money on anyway, purely out of habit, or social pressure, or simple inattention. Ramit's argument is that instead of cutting spending evenly across every single category, which is what traditional budgeting advice tends to push, the smarter move is to identify your specific money dials, the 2 or 3 things you genuinely love spending on, and then cut ruthlessly, almost aggressively, on everything else, redirecting that saved money toward the dials that actually bring you real, lasting happiness. There's a story of a woman who went through this exercise and discovered something that genuinely surprised her. Her money dial, the thing she cared about more than almost anything else, was travel. Specifically, the kind of travel where she could fully disconnect for a week or 2 at a time without financial anxiety hovering over the entire trip. But she'd been spending significant money on a gym membership she rarely used, a subscription box she'd forgotten she was even paying for, and a slightly larger apartment than she genuinely needed, purely because it seemed like the responsible adult thing to have at her age. Once she identified her actual money dial, she cut the gym membership entirely, canceled the subscription box, and downsized her apartment slightly, redirecting all of that freed-up money directly into a dedicated travel fund. The following year, she took the most meaningful trip of her life, 2 full weeks, completely paid for in advance, with 0 credit card debt attached to it afterward. And she described the experience as the first time in years she'd spent significant money on something and felt absolutely no guilt about it at all, because she'd made the decision consciously, with real numbers behind it, rather than just hoping it would somehow work out. This is the emotional core of Ramit's entire philosophy, and it's worth pausing on directly. Being rich, in his specific definition, was never about depriving yourself of everything you enjoy in the name of some distant future. It was about building a system precise enough that you could spend extravagantly, guiltlessly, on the small number of things that genuinely matter to you, while eliminating the things that don't matter at all, almost without a second thought. Now, here's where the story shifts into something a bit more technical, though I promise it's going to stay just as relevant, because this next piece is where most of the actual wealth building happens, quietly, in the background, without requiring daily attention at all. Ramit is famous for a specific piece of advice that tends to shock people the first time they hear it, precisely because it goes against almost everything popular personal finance culture teaches. Automate your finances so completely that you barely have to think about money at all on a day-to-day basis. Here's how this typically works in practice. Your paycheck arrives, and instead of that money simply landing in your checking account, waiting for you to manually decide what to do with it or forget entirely, a portion goes straight into your retirement account, ideally enough to capture any employer matching contribution available to you, because that specific match is, quite literally, free money that most people leave completely on the table without ever realizing. A portion goes into a separate investment account, invested automatically into a diversified, low-cost index fund or target date fund, something that doesn't require you to pick individual stocks or time the market, both of which, according to decades of research, Ramit frequently cites, most professional investors fail to do successfully over the long run, let alone amateurs managing money on the side of a full-time job. A portion goes into your emergency fund until it reaches a target that would cover several months of essential expenses, and whatever's left after all of that has already happened automatically is genuinely yours to spend however you'd like, without guilt, because the actual wealth building has already occurred before you even had the chance to second. There's a story Ramit tells about a couple who implemented this system and, roughly a year later, genuinely couldn't remember the last time they'd had a serious argument about money. Not because they'd suddenly started earning significantly more, because the decisions that used to cause tension, whether to save this month, whether they could afford that vacation, whether they were being responsible enough, had already been made once, up front, and then automated completely, removing the need to relitigate the exact same decision every single month, which is precisely the kind of repeated friction that quietly wears down even strong relationships over time. Here's a pause worth taking right now, honestly, with nobody else watching. If your paycheck arrived tomorrow, and you did absolutely nothing, made zero manual decisions, would any meaningful amount of it end up invested or saved, or would all of it simply sit in your checking account, waiting for you to decide, day by day, what to do with it? Because that single question tends to reveal, more accurately than almost anything else, whether your financial life is actually working for you in the background, or whether it's entirely dependent on your own daily willpower holding up indefinitely, which, statistically, it eventually won't. Now let's talk about something Ramit gets genuinely animated about, a concept he calls the 85% solution, and it might be one of the most practically useful ideas in his entire body of work, specifically because it targets a very particular kind of person, the kind who's actually reading personal finance content in the first place. Here's the problem he identified. A lot of financially engaged, intelligent people get completely stuck, not because they don't understand investing, but because they're paralyzed by the desire to find the absolute perfect answer before taking any action at all. Which specific index fund is technically optimal? Which brokerage has marginally lower fees? Which exact allocation between stocks and bonds is mathematically ideal for their precise situation? And while they're busy researching, comparing, reading one more article, watching one more video, years go by and their money sits completely uninvested, earning essentially nothing, while the search for perfection quietly costs them far more than any suboptimal choice ever could have. Ramit's argument, and it's a genuinely liberating one once it lands properly, is that getting to a solution that's roughly 85% as good as the theoretically perfect one, and actually implementing it today, dramatically outperforms searching for the perfect solution and never actually acting on it at all. There's a story of a man who spent nearly 2 years researching, which specific brokerage account to open, reading forums, comparing fee structures down to fractions of a percent, genuinely trying to make the best possible decision. During those 2 years, his money sat in a savings account earning almost nothing, while the market, over that same period, grew substantially. When he finally sat down and calculated what those 2 years of research had actually cost him in terms of lost growth, the number dwarfed any fee difference he could have possibly saved by choosing the marginally better brokerage in the first place. He'd optimized the wrong variable entirely, spending enormous energy chasing a small improvement while ignoring the much larger cost of simply not acting at all. This is exactly the pattern Ramit's 85% solution is designed to interrupt, and it applies well beyond investing specifically. Pick a good enough option today and actually start, rather than waiting indefinitely for a perfect option that, in most cases, doesn't meaningfully outperform the good enough one anyway, once you account for all the time lost waiting for it. Now here's a piece of this philosophy that tends to surprise people the most because it involves something most personal finance advice treats as an enemy, something Ramit treats almost like a tool, if used correctly. Credit cards, conventional wisdom, and honestly, a lot of it for good reason, treats credit cards with deep suspicion, warning people away from them entirely, worried about debt, about interest, about the psychological ease of spending money you don't actually have in your account yet. Ramit's position is more nuanced, and it's worth understanding carefully because misapplying it can genuinely hurt you, while applying it correctly can meaningfully help you. His argument is that a credit card, used with total discipline, paid off in full every single month without exception, can actually become a tool that works in your favor through rewards programs, cash back, travel points, purchase protections that a debit card simply doesn't offer. But, and this is the critical piece he's always careful to emphasize, interest charges themselves. There's a story of a young professional who followed this advice carefully, using a single rewards credit card for all of her regular monthly expenses, groceries, gas, recurring bills, and paying the entire balance off automatically, in full, every single month through the automated system we talked about earlier. Over the course of a year, without changing a single spending habit, without buying anything she wouldn't have bought anyway, she accumulated enough points to cover a significant portion of a flight for a family visit she'd been putting off for financial reasons. The card didn't change her spending at all. It simply captured value from spending she was already going to do regardless, purely because she'd built the underlying discipline first, before ever leaning on the tool. This is a genuinely important distinction, and it's worth being direct about it, because this exact idea, used without the underlying discipline in place first, is precisely how people end up in serious debt, and Ramit is consistently clear about that risk in his own teaching. The tool amplifies whatever habit is already there. Good habits, amplified through rewards. Bad habits, amplified through compounding interest that can spiral out of control shockingly fast. Now, let's talk about something Ramit calls invisible scripts, because this might be the most psychologically interesting piece of his entire philosophy, and it explains something that pure numbers and spreadsheets never quite capture on their own. An invisible script is a belief about money that you absorb so early in life, usually from family, sometimes from culture more broadly, that you've never actually stopped to question it directly, even though it quietly governs many of your financial decisions without you fully realizing it. There's a story of a woman who grew up in a household where money was discussed constantly in terms of scarcity, always careful, always worried, always one unexpected expense away from disaster. Even though Looking back as an adult, her family's actual financial situation had been reasonably stable the entire time. That early environment installed an invisible script in her, something along the lines of money is always about to run out, and decades later, as a genuinely successful professional earning a strong income, she still found herself panicking over completely manageable expenses, still found herself unable to relax financially, even when the actual numbers said she had every reason to. It wasn't until she consciously identified this specific script, named it directly, that she was able to start questioning whether it still served her, and gradually, deliberately, replace it with something more accurate to her actual current situation. Ramit argues that almost everyone carries at least one of these invisible scripts, whether it's a belief that talking about money is impolite, or that wanting more money is somehow greedy, or that people who are good with money were simply born that way, rather than having learned specific, teachable skills. And here's why this matters so much practically, not just emotionally. You can build the most perfect automated system in the world, the ideal conscious spending plan, the smartest investment strategy, and an invisible script running quietly in the background can still sabotage all of it, causing you to pull money out of investments during a market dip out of pure panic, or refuse to negotiate a salary you clearly deserve because some old, unexamined belief tells you that asking for more makes you difficult or ungrateful. This is worth pausing on, honestly, right now. What's one belief about money you absorbed early in life, one you've never really stopped to question directly, that might still be quietly shaping decisions you make today? Now let's talk about negotiation, because Ramit treats this specific skill as one of the single highest leverage financial moves almost anyone can make, and yet, it's a move the overwhelming majority of people never attempt, even once, in their entire careers. There's a story of a woman who, after years of feeling underpaid but too anxious to ever bring it up, finally decided to prepare for a salary negotiation using a specific framework Ramit teaches, gathering concrete examples of her actual contributions, researching realistic market rates for her role, and practicing the actual conversation out loud multiple times before ever walking into her manager's office. She was terrified going in. The conversation itself lasted less than 15 minutes. She walked out with a raise larger than any annual increase she'd received in her previous 6 years combined, a single 15-minute conversation producing more financial impact than half a decade of quietly hoping she'd eventually be noticed and rewarded on her own. Ramit's point here connects directly back to the big wins versus small wins idea from earlier in this story. An hour spent preparing for a single negotiation conversation can produce more lasting financial impact than years of carefully skipping $4 coffees. And yet the coffee gets talked about constantly in personal finance culture, while the negotiation almost never does, largely because negotiating feels uncomfortable, confrontational, risky, in a way that skipping a coffee simply doesn't. But discomfort, according to this entire philosophy, was never a reason to avoid the highest leverage moves available to you. It was simply the price of admission for actually getting them. Let's bring all of this into the world you're actually living in right now, because Ramit built much of this philosophy over a decade ago, and the specific pressures working against it have, in some ways, become even sharper since then. Today, the guilt culture around small spending decisions has arguably intensified, not softened, fueled by an entire ecosystem of financial content creators, building audiences specifically around no-spend challenges, extreme frugality tracking, and a kind of performative austerity, well online, but rarely addresses the actual big-picture decisions that determine long-term wealth. Meanwhile, automation tools have genuinely improved. making Ramit's core advice easier to implement than ever. Automatic transfers, automatic investing, round-up savings features built directly into most modern banking apps, meaning the actual technical barrier to building the kind of system he describes has never been lower, even as the psychological barrier, the guilt, the invisible scripts, the fear of negotiating, remains stubbornly high for most people. Here's the modern application, worth genuinely acting on this week, something concrete, something you can actually start in the next few days. Set up or review exactly one automated transfer, moving money directly into an investment account the day your paycheck arrives, before you ever see it sitting in checking, waiting to be spent on something else instead. Then, separately, identify your own specific money dials, the 2 or 3 things you genuinely, deeply care about spending money on, and find one thing you're currently spending on, cut that one thing, and redirect the money, consciously, deliberately, toward whichever dial matters most to you. That's the entire philosophy, distilled into 2 concrete actions. Automate the big decision, so it happens without requiring daily willpower, and consciously redirect the smaller decisions toward what genuinely brings you fulfillment, rather than obsessing evenly over everything at once. Let's return, one final time, to that woman at her kitchen table at midnight, staring at a $4.20 receipt, like it might explain something important about her entire financial life. Here's how her story actually continued, because it's worth knowing. She closed the 4 budgeting apps that night permanently, and instead spent a single weekend setting up one automated system, moving a fixed percentage of every paycheck directly into an index fund before she ever saw the money land in her checking account. She identified her own money dial, which turned out to be spontaneous weekend trips with close friends, something she'd been quietly denying herself for years in the name of vague, undefined financial responsibility. She canceled 3 subscriptions she'd forgotten she was even paying for, and redirected that money directly into a dedicated fund for exactly those spontaneous trips. 6 months later, she negotiated her salary for the first time in her entire career, using the exact preparation framework we just walked through together, and received a raise that, on its own, dwarfed every dollar she'd ever agonized over at a coffee shop counter. She still buys coffee, by the way, most mornings, without a second thought, without any guilt at all, because the actual math, the honest, complete math of her financial life, had finally been handled somewhere else entirely, quietly, automatically, in the background, freeing her to stop treating every small purchase like a moral test she was constantly failing. If this reframing, big wins over small sacrifices, systems over willpower, spending extravagantly on what you love while cutting mercilessly on what you don't, resonated with you at all, the only thing I'll ever ask of you. Because somewhere out there right now, there's another person sitting at their own kitchen table, staring at their own small receipt, feeling guilty about the wrong number entirely, while a much larger, much more important decision sits completely untouched, waiting quietly in the background for someone to finally stop overthinking the coffee and start automating the things that actually matter. The $4 was never really the problem. It never is. The real question, the one worth asking yourself long after this video ends, was always about the 96% of your financial life you've been quietly ignoring, while a tiny 4% has been keeping you up at midnight, over and over again, for years.